In this section, I'd like to work on making a countdown timer for our game. Again, we're going to do this just in our prototyping section rather than in the VR section, because once we're in VR, it can be a little bit harder to test out. So let's get it done now. Now we're going to have to use something we haven't used before, which is called Text Mesh Pro, and this is an asset I haven't installed yet, but I've got it ready here, and it's another free asset, and let's just import this. And what Text Mesh Pro does is it replaces Unity's default text with its own Text Mesh Pro system. And I'm going to show you the difference between the built-in Unity text and Text Mesh Pro. And by the time you're watching this video, Text Mesh Pro actually has been purchased by Unity, and in future versions it may be actually included within Unity. But for now, it's still a separate asset on the asset store. So you do need to download and import it. For us to use Text Mesh Pro, we're also going to need some custom actions for Playmaker. So Playmaker, out of the box, does not control Text Mesh Pro. So what I've done is I've written a bunch of custom actions in C# so that we can control Text Mesh Pro from Playmaker. So we'll need to go ahead and download those from my GitHub account after we take a look at it. So let's go to the scene and we'll just zoom out a little bit. Oopsie. And I am going to add some text here to the scene so we can have a look. And let's just add this no-go to our environment. And we can have this trigger area. Maybe I'll create another empty game object called music. We'll put these in. There we go. So now let's add some text to the scene. So if we right click here and we choose 3D object, we have the built-in Unity 3D text here. So let's just click this, and I'll zoom into it's way over there. Drag this up a bit so I can see it better. And as you can see, it's text. It sits, three-dimensionally, in our world. And it starts off with the words "Hello World." And as you can see, it's fairly pixelated. This is not very sharp text. And we can adjust this by maybe changing the character size larger, and then shrinking it down, something like this. So it starts to get somewhat sharper, and it's not a good way to do this. Maybe if we increase the font size. No, I don't know. At this point, we don't even bother with this regular text. It's just too much of a pain in the butt. And what we're going to use is Text Mesh Pro. So here's we'll call this old text. And I'll show you the Text Mesh Pro text. So now that we have the Text Mesh Pro, don't forget to hit enter. Now that we have Text Mesh Pro, we can also right-click, choose 3D Object, and then choose Text Mesh Pro Text. And let's see where that ended up. We'll just move it over here. Okay, and let's just size this down a little bit so it's somewhat of a similar size. So it's character size 36. Let's just set it to say like 12. And drag this over. And so now you can already see there's a huge difference in the quality between these two types of text. There's really no reason to be using the built-in Unity text anymore when you have Text Mesh Pro. Okay, so why we're talking about text here is because we're going to need some way to display our countdown timer on the screen. And to do that, we're going to need text. And text in Unity is essentially a string. And in our variable section of this course just before this, we talked about different types of variables. So here in this example, have our making our countdown timer. We're going to look at different types of variables and what they can do for us. Now I'm going to make a new game object, and I'm going to call this timer, and this is going to hold my FSM. And why don't I just zero this out like I like to. And this is going to hold our timer FSM. So we're going to go to Playmaker, right click, and this will start a new FSM on here. So let's just give it a description. Timer for counting down seconds left in the game. And state 1, we're just going to call it start, countdown. Description, timer, counting down before, say, automatic death. Let's have it kill us when we don't finish our game by this amount of time. So the first thing I want to do is set the amount of time that we want to count down from, and we're going to do this by making a variable. And this variable is going to be let's use an int. We'll use integers here. Let me double check that. We can go int to, let's say, seconds to string. Just going to double check what kind of, okay, uses a float, so let's do that. Okay, so we're going to need a float. So we're going to go to our variables, and the variable type we want to make here is a float. And we're going to call this, time. We'll just call it the time. And currently this value is set at 0. There is 0 time. So when we start the game, we want there to be a specific amount of time. So let's say, for example, we want there to be, 300 seconds of time. And a little trick here that we haven't looked at yet, I don't think, is if we go to timer and we go to inspector, we can't see our variable here, but if we choose this inspector button, now under the controls we have the time. So we can just set it here, from the inspector easy, without having to, go into this variables tab and change it. So this is good for when we want to tweak our game and make some quick changes just from the inspector. So the next thing I want to do is take this time and start counting down from it 1 second at a time. So we're going to go to our first state, and we have float. Because we're working with the float, so we want to use some kind of a float mathematical thing here. So we've got float, ABS, add, multiply, clamp, divide, operate, subtract. And we could use the float subtract, or we can also use the float add. So float subtract, of course, if we used it, we would just say subtract 1. But we can also use the float add and say add -1. Both of these will work just the same. So I'm going to use the float subtract just to keep things nice and clean. So what we want to do is subtract 1 every second. So we're going to need every frame so that it keeps running all the time. If we don't have every frame, this is just going to fire 1 time. It'll fire once and then stop. And for us, that's no good. We don't want it to fire once. We want it to always be constantly checking itself to see if something should be happening. So yes. How often? Once per second. So now what variable do we want to affect? What do we want to subtract from? So we've already set up the time. So we're going to subtract 1 from the time every second. So now we've already got our countdown timer working. So let's just hit save this and hit play. And if you have debug here checked on the bottom, it's going to show the number here in the inspector 300. Let's click play. And as you can see, it's already removing 1 per second. So our next step is we need to somehow get this onto the screen. And to get it onto the screen, we need to change it into a string. Okay, a string is the only thing that can be displayed on the screen. We can't display a float directly or an int or anything else. We need to get the string of it. So luckily Playmaker can help us do this. And what we want to do is, actually we've already searched float here, it's up the top for my list. Convert float to, not an int, but convert float to string. Here it is, float to string. So what float variable do we want to convert? The time. And we need to save it in another variable, a string variable. And we don't have any made yet, so we can just create a new one here by choosing new variable. And I'm just going to call this the time. And it says this name already exists. I'll show you a little trick. If you go underscore and add the word string, and now when you click on it, it says the time dash string. So we don't have to do it this way. You could just put the words the time string all in one. Just this little under dash trick just gives you sort of a nice way to look at it so you know that it's a string. Okay, so we've got it converted to a string, and let's push play. Oh, well, let's push play and see what happens here. So we can see that the float is counting down, but the string hasn't changed. That's because we forgot to check every frame. It's only checking 1 time. So let's click every frame. And now that we see it's also counting down every frame. This checks every frame, this checks every frame. And so they keep in sync. Next, we want to get this onto the screen somehow. So this is the part where we need to install some new actions so we can access the Text Mesh Pro. So way up here. So currently, for example, if we type into our actions, we say text mesh, nothing comes up that's helpful for us. So how to do this is we're going to need to navigate over to a website, my website in fact, to download these custom actions. And to do that, you're going to need to open up a web browser. So I've opened up Google Chrome on my computer, and I've navigated over to my GitHub account, my Dumb Game Dev GitHub account. And what GitHub is just for storing code online for free. So there's going to be a link to this in the description of this video so that you can find this. And once we're here, we're going to click on repositories, and it's going to show all of the different repositories or folders, so to speak, that we have. And so as you can see, these are all pretty much Playmaker ones. Scroll down, we can find one called Text Mesh Pro Playmaker. So these are custom Playmaker actions for Text Mesh Pro and Unity. So if we click on it, we've got a nice README here tutorial if you want to read through it, but currently says these are only working for 5.6 or above of Unity. That's not true. They are actually have been fixed for running for 2017's version of Unity, so I'll have to change this warning message. So to download these actions, you're just going to click here and then choose Download Zip. And what this should do is just download a zip folder to your computer, and you can click Show in Folder. And I'm using WinRAR. You can use whatever program you want. And the next thing I'm going to do is open up Unity. And I guess what we're going to need to do is actually open up the folder first and then put them there. So instead, click on Assets and right click and then choose Show in Explorer. So this is going to open up your assets folder, and make sure to open up assets, not to put in your library or any of these other folders. So once you're in assets, you can go ahead and drag and drop it in there. So it should be called TextMesh Pro _ Playmaker or master. You could rename this to be whatever you want. It doesn't matter as long as it's all within your assets folder. So we'll close this up. We'll close this up. And then now we see that Unity is recompiling because it has to compile these new scripts. And I'm getting a bunch of errors from other things. It's fine, we'll just clear that up. This is unfortunately because we're in the 2017.1 beta, so hopefully most of these errors should be solved by the time you're watching this. If not, it doesn't affect what we're doing. So now we have TextMesh Pro, which we imported, and now we have TextMesh Pro Playmaker. So let's go back to our timer, go back to Playmaker, and so it seems like we lost our string here and our action window. So we'll click Action Browser to get that back. Put it back up there. Convert float to string, which float. The time string. Every frame. Okay, now we should have some TextMesh Pro actions here. So we are not going to use the TextMesh Pro U GUI for this. We're just going to use the TextMesh Pro regular. And in a later section, we're going to talk about U GUI and making menus. But for now, we'll just use the normal TextMesh Pro action. So what we want to do is just set text. So I want to use not the GUI text, but I'm going to use the TextMesh Pro Basic. So we have set TextMesh Pro text. So let's double click. And we'll move this down to the bottom because we want it to happen last. First we want it to subtract, then convert to a string, and then we want the string to show up on the TextMesh Pro text. So it's saying this game object requires a TextMesh Pro component. Okay, well we don't want to use the timer, we want to use this TextMesh Pro up here. And how we're going to do that is we're going to go back to our timer, lock the screen, and we don't want to use the owner, we're going to say specify a game object. So which game object do we want to use? The TextMesh Pro game object. And you can see the warning is gone because it knows this is TextMesh Pro text. So for example, we could type like, hello world, and push play, see what happens. We can't see, we'll have to go to our scene, and you can see it's changed to say hello world. But we don't want it to say hello world, we want it to count down our seconds. So how we do that is, don't forget to check every frame, and then next to the TextMesh Pro text, we're going to click this little icon that says use variable, because we want it to use the time string. So click here and choose the time string. Let's hit play again. And then now we can see the seconds are counting down. So it's not bad, but it's still sort of ugly because it's, we've got this 0.000 of a second going, which is not what we want. So we can apply formatting to the string here. And I have pre-calculated the format for you, and so you don't need to do this. If you want to look into string formatting, you can go ahead and do that. But for now, I just really recommend that you use my pre-calculated format. And it's just going to give me, hours, minutes, and seconds. And we'll just copy and paste. Okay, so now that we've got our formatting in here, let's just push play again and see how this looks. And that's not what we want. we've got it currently set to convert float to string, and this is my mistake. We're going to need a special action for this. We want seconds to string, because this is a very specific formatting. Yikes. Okay, so let's remove this convert float to string. We want it to be seconds, so our seconds variable is the time. Our string variable is still the time, and it seems like it already has a built-in format for us. Let's try that and see. Oh no, we forgot every frame. Okay, there we go. So now we've got actually hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, and I'm going to adjust mine slightly. I don't want hours. So what happens if we just remove this H? Push play. So now we've got minutes and seconds, and I don't want milliseconds. I'm going to remove the milliseconds. So we'll remove the MS and the 10 milliseconds. Push play. Ah, there we go. That's exactly what I want. Okay, so the last thing I want to do here is position this somewhere that is, relative to the player, so the player can see what's going on. So I've got it called TextMesh Pro. I'm going to name this, TMP, so I know it's TextMesh Pro. Call it time left. And just like the camera, I want to position this in front of my player. So I am going to do it this way. Let's grab the player. No, I guess I'll just move it. So we'll just move it down here. Zoop, zoop, zoop. And there's more advanced ways to do this, and we're going to look at some more advanced ways later. But for now, I'm just going to put it into the scene like this. So let's put it fairly close to him so that we don't accidentally clip it on things. And this is huge, so let's make this smaller. So let's scale this down, 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. It's way over there now. We can just grab our game view and move it over here. And we'll just move it even closer. So, okay, for now this sort of works for me. It's not perfect, but it's, I think good enough. So let's just hit play. And we'll worry about adjusting these exact positions later. Uh-oh. We forgot to do one thing here. We forgot to parent it to our controller. There we go. So it's at a slight angle, and we'll need to adjust that later when we're doing the VR version. For now, I'm not going to worry about it too much because, we're going to have to make adjustments for VR anyways. We just want to make sure that it's working and that it's going the way we want it to. So in the next video, what we're going to do is set up a end game event so that when this countdown reaches the end of the countdown, it's going to trigger an event that says, the end, blah, blah. So we'll do that in the next